Okay. Chapter 12. Shadow drove west across Wisconsin and Minnesota and into North Dakota, where the snow... Am I close enough to the mic? I can move now because Bagheera left. I can move this. My whole situation here. Whoop. You can hear me fine. Okay, that's good. I can never tell with this microphone, but I could look at the levels that are on OBS, I guess. But oh well, I already moved. It's too late. None of the cats are here anymore. I don't know where they went. Okay, anyway. Okay. So, Shadow drove west across Wisconsin and Minnesota and into North Dakota, where the snow-covered hills looked like huge sleeping buffalo, and he and Wednesday saw nothing but nothing, and plenty of it, for mile after mile. They went south, then into South Dakota, heading for reservation country. Wednesday had traded in the Lincoln Town Car, which Shadow had liked driving, for a lumbering and ancient Winnebago, which smelled non-specifically but pervasively and unmistakably of male cat, and which he didn't enjoy driving at all. As they passed their first signpost for Mount Rushmore, still several hundred miles away, Wednesday grunted. "Now that," he said, "is a holy place." Shadow had thought Wednesday was asleep. He said, "I know it used to be sacred to the Indians." "It's a holy place," said Wednesday. "That's the American way. They need to give people an excuse to come and worship. These days, people can't just go and see a mountain. Thus, Mr. Gutzon Borglum's tremendous presidential faces. Once they were carved, permission was granted, and now the people drive out in their multitudes to see something in the flesh that they've already seen on 1,000 postcards." I think we've switched to Shadow. "I knew a guy once. He did weight training at the muscle farm years back. He said that the Dakota Indians, the young men, climb up the mountain, then form death-defying human chains off the heads, just so that the guy at the end of the chain can piss on the president's nose." Wednesday guffawed. "Oh, fine. Very fine. Is any specific president the particular butt of their ire?" Shadow shrugged. "He never said." Miles vanished beneath the wheels of the Winnebago. Shadow began to imagine that he was staying still while the American landscape moved past them at a steady 67 miles per hour. A wintry mist fogged the edges of things. It was midday on the second day of the drive, and they were almost there. Shadow, who had been thinking, said, "A girl vanished from Lakeside last week, when we were in San Francisco." Wednesday sounded barely interested. "Kid named Allison McGovern. She's not the first kid to vanish there. There have been others. They go in the wintertime." Wednesday furrowed his brow. "It is a tragedy, is it not? The little faces on the milk cartons. Although I can't remember the last time I saw a kid on a milk carton. And on the walls of freeway rest areas, 'Have you seen me?' they ask. A deeply existential question at the best of times. 'Have you seen me?' Pull off at the next exit." Shadow thought he heard a helicopter pass overhead, but the clouds were too low to see anything. "Why did you pick Lakeside?" asked Shadow. "I told you, it's a nice quiet place to hide you away. You're off the board there, under the radar." "Why?" "Because that's the way it is. Now hang a left," said Wednesday. Shadow turned left. "There's something wrong," said Wednesday. "Fuck. Jesus fucking Christ on a bicycle. Slow down, but don't stop." "Care to elaborate?" "Trouble. Do you know any alternative routes?" "Not really. This is my first time in South Dakota," said Shadow. "Also, I don't know where we're going." On the other side of the hill, something flashed redly, smudged by the mist. "Roadblock," said Wednesday. He pushed his hand deeply into first one pocket of his suit, then another, searching for something. "I can stop and turn around. If we had a jeep, I'd go off-road, but the Winnebago's just going to tip if I try and drive her across that ditch." "We can't turn. They're behind us as well," said Wednesday. "Take your speed down to 15 miles per hour." Shadow glanced into the mirror. There were headlights behind them, under a mile back. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Wednesday snorted. "Sure as eggs," he said. "As the turkey farmer said when he hatched his first turtle. Ah, success!" And from the bottom of a pocket he produced a small piece of white chalk. He started to scratch with the chalk on the dashboard of the camper, making marks as if he were solving an algebraic puzzle. Or perhaps, Shadow thought, as if he were a hobo scratching long messages to the other hobos in hobo code. Bad dog here, dangerous town, nice woman, soft jail in which to overnight. Okay, said Wednesday. Now increase your speed to 30, and don't slow down from that. One of the cars behind them turned on its lights and siren and accelerated toward them. Do not slow down, repeated Wednesday. They just want us to slow before we get to the roadblock. Scratch, scratch, scratch. They crested the hill. The roadblock was less than a quarter of a mile away. 12 cars arranged across the road, and on the side of the road, police cars and several big black SUVs. There, said Wednesday, and he put his chalk away. The dashboard of the Winnebago was now covered with rune-like scratchings. The car with the siren was just behind them. It had slowed to their speed, and an amplified voice was shouting, "Pull over!" Shadow looked at Wednesday. "Turn right," said Wednesday. "Just pull off the road." "I can't take this thing off-road. We'll tip." "It'll be fine. Take a right. Now!" Shadow pulled the wheel down with his right hand, and the Winnebago lurched and jolted. For a moment he thought he had been correct, that the camper was going to tip, and then the world through the windshield dissolved and shimmered, like the reflection in a clear pool when the wind brushes the surface, and the Dakota stretched and shifted. The clouds and the mist and the snow and the day were gone. Now there were stars overhead, hanging like frozen spears of light, stabbing the night sky. "Park here," said Wednesday. "We can walk the rest of the way." Shadow turned off the engine. He went into the back of the Winnebago, pulled on his coat, his sorrel winter boots, and his gloves. Then he climbed out of the vehicle and waited. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." Wednesday looked at him with amusement and something else, irritation perhaps, or pride. "Why don't you argue?" asked Wednesday. "Why don't you exclaim that it's all impossible? Why the hell do you just do what I say and take it all so fucking calmly?" "Because you're not paying me to ask questions," said Shadow. And then he said, realizing the truth as the words came out of his mouth, "Anyway, nothing's really surprised me since Laura. Since she came back from the dead. Since I learned that she was screwing Robbie. That one hurt. Everything else just sits on the surface. Where are we going now?" Wednesday pointed and they began to walk. The ground beneath their feet was rock of some kind, slick and volcanic, occasionally glassy. The air was chilly, but not winter cold. They sidestepped their way awkwardly down a hill. There was a rough path, and they followed it. Shadow looked down to the bottom of the hill and realized that what he was looking at was impossible. "What the hell is that?" asked Shadow, but Wednesday touched his finger to his lips, shook his head sharply. Silence. It looked like a mechanical spider, blue metal, glittering LED lights, and it was the size of a tractor. It squatted at the bottom of the hill. Beyond it were an assortment of bones, each with a flame beside it, little bigger than a candle flame, flickering. Wednesday gestured for Shadow to keep his distance from these objects. Shadow took an extra step to the side, which was a mistake, on that grassy path, and his ankle twisted and he tumbled down the slope as if he had been dropped, rolling and slipping and bouncing. He grabbed at a rock as he went past, and the obsidian snag ripped his leather glove as if it were paper. He came to rest at the bottom of the hill, between the mechanical spider and the bones. He put a hand down to push himself to his feet, and found himself touching what appeared to be a thigh bone with the palm of his hand, and he was standing in the daylight, smoking a cigarette and looking at his watch. There were cars all around him, some empty, some not. He was wishing he had not had that last cup of coffee, for he dearly needed a piss, and it was starting to become uncomfortable. One of the local law enforcement people came over to him, a big man with frost in his walrus mustache. He had already forgotten the man's name. "I don't know how we could have lost them," says local law enforcement, apologetic and puzzled. "It was an optical illusion," he replies. "You get them in freak weather conditions. The mist. It was a mirage. They were driving down some other road. We thought they were on this one." Local law enforcement looks disappointed. "Oh, I thought it was maybe like an X-Files kind of thing," he says. "Nothing so exciting, I'm afraid." He suffers from occasional hemorrhoids, and his ass has just started itching in the way that signals that a flare-up is coming. He wants to be back inside the Beltway. He wishes there was a tree to go and stand behind. The urge to piss is getting worse. He drops the cigarette and steps on it. Local law enforcement walks over to one of the police cars and says something to the driver. They both shake their heads. He wonders if he should simply grit his teeth, try to imagine that he is in Maui with no one else around, and piss against the rear wheel of the car. He wishes he weren't so utterly pea-shy, and he thinks maybe he can hold it in for longer, but he finds himself remembering a newspaper clipping that someone had tacked up in the lounge in his frat house 30 years before. The cautionary tale of an old man who had been on a long bus ride with a busted restroom, who had held it in, and at the end of his journey needed to be catheterized in order to ever piss again. That was ridiculous. He isn't that old. He is going to celebrate his 50th birthday in April, and his waterworks work just fine. Everything works just fine. He pulls out his telephone, touches the menu, pages down, and finds the address entry marked laundry, which had amused him so much when he typed it in, a reference to the man from U.N.C.L.E. And as he looks at it, he realizes that it's not from that at all, that it was a tailor's he's thinking of. Get smart. And he still feels weird and slightly embarrassed after all these years about not realizing it was a comedy when he was a kid and just wanting a shoe phone. A woman's voice on the phone. Yes? This is Mr. Town, for Mr. World. Hold, please. I'll see if he's available. There is silence. Town crosses his legs, tugs his belt higher on his belly. Got to lose these last 10 pounds. And away from his bladder. Then an urbane voice says, Hello, Mr. Town. We lost them, says Town. He feels a knot of frustration in his gut. These were the bastards, the lousy, dirty sons of bitches who killed Woody and Stone, for Christ's sakes. Good men. Good men. He badly wants to fuck Mrs. Wood, but knows it's still too soon after Woody's death to make a move, so he is taking her out for dinner every couple weeks, an investment in the future. She's just grateful for the attention. How? I don't know. We set up a roadblock. There was nowhere they could have gone, and they went there anyway. Just another one of life's little mysteries. Not to worry. Have you calmed the locals? Told them it was an optical illusion. They buy it? Probably. There was something very familiar about Mr. World's voice, which was a strange thing to think. He'd been working for him directly for 2 years now, spoken to him every day. Of course there was something familiar about his voice. They'll be far away by now. Should we send people down to Res to intercept them? Not worth the aggravation. Too many jurisdictional issues, and there are only so many strings we can pull in a morning. We have plenty of time. Just get back there. I've got my hands full at this end, trying to organize the policy meeting. Trouble? It's a pissing contest. I've proposed that we have it out here. The techies want it in Austin, or maybe San Jose. The players want it in Hollywood. The intangibles want it on Wall Street. Everyone wants it in their own backyard. Nobody's going to give. You need me to do anything? Not yet. I'll growl at some of them, stroke others. You know the routine. Yes, sir. Carry on, Town. The connection is broken. Town thinks he should have had a SWAT team to pick off that fucking Winnebago, or landmines on the road, or tactical friggin' nuclear device. That would have showed those bastards they meant business. It was like... There they go again. Jesus Christ. Get off the box. All I have to do is lift this and they move. The spray bottle. It was like Mr. World had once said to him. We are writing the future in letters of fire, and Mr. Town thinks that Jesus Christ, if he doesn't piss now, he'll lose a kidney. It'll just burst. And it was like his pop had said when they were on long journeys, when Town was a kid. Out on the interstate, his pop would always say, My back teeth are afloat. And Mr. Town could hear that voice even now, that sharp Yankee accent saying, I got to take a leak soon. My back teeth are afloat. Hello, Louis. And it was then that Shadow felt a hand opening his own hand, prizing it open, one finger at a time, off the thigh bone it was clutching. He no longer needed to urinate. That was someone else. He was standing under the stairs on a glassy rock plain, and the bone was down on the ground beside the other bones. Wednesday made the signal for silence again. Then he began to walk, and Shadow followed. There was a creak from the mechanical spider, and Wednesday froze. Shadow stopped and waited with him. Green lights flickered and ran up and along its side in clusters. Shadow tried not to breathe too loudly. He thought about what had just happened. It had been like looking through a window into someone else's mind. And then he thought, Mr. World, it was me who thought his voice sounded familiar. That was my thought. That was my thought, not Town's. That was why it seemed so strange. He tried to identify the voice in his mind, to put it into the category in which it belonged, but it eluded him. It'll come to me, thought Shadow. Sooner or later, it'll come to me. The green lights went blue, then red, then faded to a dull red, and the spider settled down on its metallic haunches. Wednesday began to walk forward, a lonely figure beneath the stars, in a broad-brimmed hat, his frayed dark cloak gusting randomly in the nowhere wind, his staff tapping on the glassy rock floor. When the metallic spider was only a distant glint in the starlight, far back on the plain, Wednesday said, "It should be safe to speak now." "Where are we?" "Behind the scenes," said Wednesday. "Sorry?" "Think of it as being behind the scenes, like in a theater or something. I just pulled us out of the audience and now we're walking about backstage. It's a shortcut." "When I touched that bone, I was in the mind of a guy named Town. He's with that spook show. He hates us." "Yes." "He's got a boss named Mr. World. He reminds me of someone, but I don't know who. I was looking into Town's head, or maybe I was in his head. I'm not certain." "Do they know where we're headed?" "I think they're calling off the hunt right now. They didn't want to follow us to the reservation." "Are we going to a reservation?" "Maybe." Wednesday leaned on his staff for a moment, then continued to walk. "What was that spider thing?" "A pattern manifestation. A search engine." "Are they dangerous?" "You only get to be my age by assuming the worst." Shadow smiled. "And how old would that be?" "Old as my tongue," said Wednesday, "and a few months older than my teeth." "You play your cards so close to your chest," said Shadow, "that I'm not even sure they're really cards at all." Wednesday only grunted. Each hill they came to was harder to climb. Shadow began to feel headachy. There was a pounding quality to the starlight, something that resonated with the pulse in his temples and his chest. At the bottom of the next hill he stumbled, opened his mouth to say something, and, without warning, he vomited. Wednesday reached into an inside pocket and produced a small hip flask. "Take a sip of this," he said. "Only a sip." The liquid was pungent, and it evaporated in his mouth like a good brandy, although it did not taste like alcohol. Wednesday took the flask away and pocketed it. "It's not good for the audience to find themselves walking about backstage. That's why you're feeling sick. We need to hurry to get you out of here." They walked faster, Wednesday at a solid trudge, Shadow stumbling from time to time, but feeling better for the drink, which left his mouth tasting of orange peel, of rosemary oil and peppermint and cloves. Wednesday took his arm. "There," he said, pointing to two identical hillocks of frozen rock glassed to their left. "Walk between those two mounds. Walk beside me." They walked, and the cold air and bright daylight smashed into Shadow's face at the same time. He stopped, closed his eyes, dazzled and light-blinded. Then, shading his eyes with his hand, he opened them once more. They were standing halfway up a gentle hill. The mist had gone, the day was sunny and chill, the sky was a perfect blue. At the bottom of the hill was a gravel road, and a red station wagon bounced along it like a child's toy car. A gust of wood smoke stung Shadow's face, making his eyes tear. The smoke came from a building nearby, which looked as if someone had picked up a mobile home and dropped it on the side of the hill 30 years ago. It was much repaired, patched, and in places added onto. Shadow was certain that the galvanized tin chimney from which the wood smoke was coming was not part of the original structure. As they reached the door, it opened, and a middle-aged man with dark skin, sharp eyes, and a mouth like a knife slash looked down at them and said, I heard that there were 2 white men on their way to see me. 2 whites in a Winnebago. And I heard that they got lost, like white men always get lost if they don't put up their signs everywhere. And now look at these 2 sorry beasts at the door. You know you're on Lakota land?" His hair was gray and long. Since when were you Lakota, you old fraud?" said Wednesday. He was wearing a coat and a flap-eared cap, and already it seemed to Shadow unlikely that only a few moments ago, under the stars, he had been wearing a broad-brimmed hat and a tattered cloak. "So, Whiskey Jack, you sad bastard, I'm starving, and my friend here just threw up his breakfast. Are you going to invite us in?" Whiskey Jack scratched an armpit. He was wearing blue jeans and an undershirt the gray of his hair. He wore moccasins and seemed not to notice the cold. Then he said, "I like it here. Come in, white men who lost their Winnebago." There was more wood smoke in the air inside the trailer, and there was another man in there, sitting at a table. The man wore stained buckskins and was barefoot. His skin was the color of bark. Wednesday seemed delighted. "Well," he said, "it seems our delay was fortuitous. Whiskey Jack and Apple Johnny. 2 birds with 1 stone." The man at the table, Apple Johnny, stared at Wednesday. Then he reached down a hand to his crotch, cupped it, and said, "Wrong again. I just checked, and I got both of my stones just where they ought to be." He looked up at Shadow, raised his hand, palm out. "I'm John Chapman. You don't mind anything your boss says about me. He's an asshole. Always was an asshole. Always going to be an asshole. Some people is just assholes, and that's the end of it. And that's an end of it." "Mike Ainsel," said Shadow. Chapman rubbed his stubby chin. Ainzel, he said. That's not a name, but it'll do at a pinch. What do they call you? Shadow. I'll call you Shadow, then. Hey, Whiskey Jack. But it wasn't really Whiskey Jack he was saying, Shadow realized. Too many syllables. How's the food looking? Whiskey Jack took a wooden spoon and lifted the lid off a black iron pot, bubbling away on the range of the wood-burning stove. It's ready for eating, he said. He took 4 plastic bowls and spooned the contents of the pot into the bowls, put them down on the table. Then he opened the door, stepped out into the snow, and pulled a plastic gallon jug from the snowbank. He brought it inside and poured 4 large glasses of a cloudy yellow-brown liquid, which he put beside each bowl. Last of all, he found 4 spoons. He sat down at the table with the other men. Wednesday raised his glass suspiciously. Looks like piss, he said. You still drinking that stuff? Asked Whiskey Jack. You white men are crazy. This is better. Then to Shadow. The stew is mostly wild turkey. John here brought the applejack. It's a soft apple cider, said John Chapman. I never believed in hard liquor. Makes men mad. The stew was delicious, and it was very good apple cider. Shadow forced himself to slow down, to chew his food, not to gulp it, but he was more hungry than he would have believed. He helped himself to a second bowl of the stew and a second glass of the cider. Dame Rumor says that you've been out talking to all manner of folk, offering them all manner of things. So you're taking the old folks on the warpath, said John Chapman. Shadow and Whiskey Jack were washing up, putting the leftover stew into Tupperware bowls. Whiskey Jack put the bowls into the snowdrifts outside his front door, and put a milk crate on top of the place he'd pushed them, so he could find them again. I think that's a fair and judicious summary of events, said Wednesday. They will win, said Whiskey Jack flatly. They won already. You lost already. Like the white man and my people. They won. And when they lost, they made treaties. Then they broke their treaties. And they won again. I'm not fighting for another lost cause. And it's no use you looking at me, said John Chapman. For even if I fought for you, which and I won't, I'm no use to you. Mangy rat-tailed bastards just picked me off and clean forgot me. He stopped. Then he said, Paul Bunyan. He shook his head slowly and said it again. Paul Bunyan. Shadow had never heard 2 such innocuous words made to sound so damning. Paul Bunyan? Shadow said. What did he ever do? He took up headspace, said Whiskey Jack. He bummed a cigarette from Wednesday, and the 2 men sat and smoked. It's like the idiots who figure that hummingbirds worry about their weight or tooth decay or some such nonsense. Maybe they just want to spare hummingbirds the evils of sugar, explained Wednesday. So they fill the hummingbird feeders with fucking NutraSweet. The birds come to the feeders and they drink it. Then they die, because their food contains no calories, even though their little tummies are full. That's Paul Bunyan for you. Nobody ever told Paul Bunyan stories. Nobody ever believed in Paul Bunyan. He came staggering out of a New York ad agency in 1910 and filled the nation's myth stomach with empty calories. I like Paul Bunyan, said Whiskey Jack. I went on his ride at the Mall of America a few years back. You see big old Paul Bunyan at the top, then you come crashing down. Splash! He's okay by me. I don't mind that he never existed. Means he never cut down any trees. Not as good as planting trees, though. That's better. You said a mouthful, said Johnny Chapman. Wednesday blew a smoke ring. It hung in the air like something from a Warner Brothers cartoon, dissipating slowly in wisps and curls. Damn it, Whiskey Jack, that's not the point and you know it. I am not going to help you, said Whiskey Jack. When you get your ass kicked, you can come back here, and if I'm still here, I'll feed you again. You get the best food in the fall. Wednesday said, All the alternatives are worse. You have no idea what the alternatives are, said Whiskey Jack. Then he looked at Shadow. You are hunting, he said. His voice was cigarette-roughened, and it resonated in that space, smoky with leaking wood smoke and cigarettes. I'm working, said Shadow. Whiskey Jack shook his head. You are also hunting something, he said. There is a debt that you wish to pay. Shadow thought of Laura's blue lips and the blood on her hands, and he nodded. Listen. Fox was here first, and his brother was the wolf. Fox said, People will live forever. If they die, they will not die for long. Wolf said, No, people will die. People must die. All things that live must die, or they will spread and cover the world and eat all the salmon and the caribou and the buffalo, eat all the squash and all the corn. Now one day Wolf died, and he said to the fox, Quick, bring me back to life. And Fox said, No, the dead must stay dead. But you convinced me." And he wept as he said this. But he said it, and it was final. Now Wolf rules the world of the dead, and Fox lives always under the sun and the moon, and he still mourns his brother. Wednesday said, "If you won't play, you won't play. We'll be moving on." Whiskey Jack's face was impassive. "I'm talking to this young man," he said. "You are beyond help. He is not." He turned back to Shadow. "You know, you cannot come to me here unless I wish it." Shadow realized that he did know this. "Yes." "Tell me your dream," said Whiskey Jack. Shadow said, I was climbing a tower of skulls. There were huge birds flying around it. They had lightning in their wings. They were attacking me. The tower fell." "Everybody dreams," said Wednesday. "Can we hit the road?" "Not everybody dreams of the Wakinya, the Thunderbirds," said Whiskey Jack. "We felt the echoes of it here." "I told you," said Wednesday. "Jesus!" "There's a clutch of Thunderbirds in West Virginia," said Chapman idly. "A couple of hens and an old cockbird, at least. There's also a breeding pair in the land. They used to call it the state of Franklin, but old Ben never got his state, up between Kentucky and Tennessee. Of course, there was never a great number of them, even at the best of times." Whiskey Jack reached out a hand the color of red clay, and he touched Shadow's face gently. His irises were light brown, banded with dark brown, and in that face those eyes seemed luminous. "Yeah," he said. "It's true. If you hunt the Thunderbird, you could bring your woman back, but she belongs to the wolf in the dead places, not walking the land." "How do you know?" asked Shadow. Whiskey Jack's lips did not move. "What did the buffalo tell you?" "To believe." "Good advice. Are you going to follow it?" "Kind of, I guess." They were talking without words, without mouths, without sound. Shadow wondered if, for the other two men in the room, they were standing, unmoving, for a heartbeat or for a fraction of a heartbeat. "When you find your tribe, come back and see me," said Whiskey Jack. "I can help." "I shall." Whiskey Jack lowered his hand. Then he turned to Wednesday. "Are you going to fetch your ho-chunk?" "My what?" "Ho-chunk. It's what the Winnebago call themselves." Wednesday shook his head. "It's too risky. Retrieving it could be problematic. They'll be looking for it." "Is it stolen?" Wednesday looked affronted. "Not a bit of it. The papers are in the glove compartment." "And the keys?" I've got them," said Shadow. "My nephew, Harry Bluejay, has an 81 Buick. Why don't you give me the keys to your camper? You can take his car." Wednesday bristled. "What kind of trade is that?" Whiskey Jack shrugged. "You know how hard it will be to bring your camper from where you abandoned it? I'm doing you a favor. Take it or leave it. I don't care." He closed his knife-wound mouth. Wednesday looked angry, and then the anger became rude, and he said, "Shadow, give the man the keys to the Winnebago." Shadow passed the car keys to Whiskey Jack. "Johnny," said Whiskey Jack, "will you take these men down to find Harry Bluejay? Tell him I said for him to give them his car." "Be my pleasure," said John Chapman. He got up and walked to the door, picked up a small Hessian sack sitting next to it, opened the door, and walked outside. Shadow and Wednesday followed him. Whiskey Jack waited in the doorway. "Hey," he said to Wednesday, "don't come back here, you. You are not welcome." Wednesday extended his middle finger heavenward. "Rotate on this," he said affably. They walked downhill through the snow, pushing their way through the drifts. Chapman walked out in front, his bare feet red against the crust-topped snow. "Aren't you cold?" asked Shadow. "My wife was Choctaw," said Chapman. "And she taught you mystical ways to keep out the cold?" "Nope, she thought I was crazy," said Chapman. "She used to say, 'Johnny, why don't you just put on boots?'" The slope of the hill became steeper, and they were forced to stop talking. The three men stumbled and slipped on the snow, using the trunks of birch trees on the hillside to steady themselves, and to stop themselves from falling. When the ground became slightly more level, Chapman said, "She's dead now, of course. When she died, I guess I maybe went a little mite crazy. It could happen to anyone. It could happen to you." He clapped Shadow on the arm. "By Jesus and Jehoshaphat, you're a big man." "So they tell me," said Shadow. They trudged down that hill for another half an hour, until they reached the gravel road that wound around the base of it, and the three men began to walk along it toward the cluster of buildings they had seen from high on the hill. A car slowed and stopped. The woman driving it reached over, wound down the passenger window, and said, "You bozos need a ride?" "You are very gracious, madam," said Wednesday. "We're looking for a Mr. Harry Bluejay." "He'll be down at the rec hall," said the woman. She was in her 40s, Shadow guessed. "Get in." They got in. Wednesday took the passenger seat. John Chapman and Shadow climbed into the back. Shadow's legs were too long to sit in the back comfortably, but he did the best he could. The car jolted forward down the gravel road. "So where did you three come from?" asked the driver. "Just visiting with a friend," said Wednesday. "Lives on the hill back there," said Shadow. "What hill?" she asked. Shadow looked back through the dusty rear window, looking back at the hill. But there was no high hill back there, nothing but clouds on the plains. "Whiskey Jack," he said. "Ah," she said. "We call him Ink Tommy here. I think it's the same guy. My grandfather used to tell some pretty good stories about him. Of course, all the best of them were kind of dirty." They hit a bump in the road, and the woman swore. "You okay back there?" "Yes, ma'am," said Johnny Chapman. He was holding onto the back seat with both hands. "Res roads," she said. "You get used to them." "Are they all like this?" asked Shadow. "Pretty much," said the woman. All the ones around here. And don't you go asking about all the money from casinos, because who in their right mind wants to come all the way out here to go to a casino? We don't see none of that money out here." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She changed gears with a crash and a groan. "You know the white population all around here is falling? You go out there, you find ghost towns. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen the world on their television screens? And it's not worth anyone's while to farm the Badlands anyhow. They took our lands, they settled here, and now they're leaving. They go south. They go west. Maybe if we wait for enough of them to move to New York and Miami and L.A., we can take the whole of the middle back without a fight." "Good luck," said Shadow. They found Harry Bluejay in the rec hall at the pool table, doing trick shots to impress a group of several girls. He had a blue jay tattooed on the back of his right hand and multiple piercings in his right ear. "Ho hoka, Harry Bluejay," said John Chapman. "Fuck off, you crazy barefoot white ghost," said Harry Bluejay conversationally. "You give me the creeps." There were older men at the far end of the room, some of them playing cards, some of them talking. There were other men, younger men of about Harry Bluejay's age, waiting for their turn at the pool table. It was a full-sized pool table, and a rip in the green baize on one side had been repaired with silver-gray duct tape. Sounds like the pool table in my apartment building. "I got a message from your uncle," said Chapman, unfazed. "He says you're to give these two your car." There must have been 30, maybe even 40 people in that hall, and now they were every one of them looking intently at their playing cards, or their feet, or their fingernails, and pretending as hard as they could not to be listening. "He's not my uncle." A cigarette smoke fug hung over the hall like a cirrus cloud. Was that supposed to be fog? Chapman smiled widely, displaying the worst set of teeth that Shadow had seen in a human mouth. "You want to tell your uncle that? He says you're the only reason he stays among the Lakota." "Whiskey Jack says a lot of things," said Harry Bluejay petulantly. But he did not say Whiskey Jack. He did not say Whiskey Jack either. It sounded almost the same to Shadow's ear, but not quite. Oh my god. Whiskey Jack, he thought. That's what they're saying, not Whiskey Jack at all. Shadow said, "Yeah, and one of the things he said was that we're trading our Winnebago for your Buick." "I don't see a Winnebago." "He'll bring you the Winnebago," said John Chapman. "You know he will." Harry Bluejay attempted a trick shot and missed. His hand was not steady enough. I'm not the old fox's nephew," said Harry Bluejay. "I wish he wouldn't say that to people." "Better a live fox than a dead wolf," said Wednesday, in a voice so deep it was almost a growl. "Now will you sell us your car?" Harry Bluejay shivered, visibly and violently. "Sure," he said. "Sure, I was only kidding. I kid a lot, me." He put down the pool cue on the pool table and took a thick jacket, pulling it out from the cluster of similar jackets hanging from pegs by the door. "Let me get my shit out of the car first," he said. He kept darting glances at Wednesday, as if he were concerned that the older man was about to explode. Harry Bluejay's car was parked 100 yards away. As they walked toward it, they passed a small, whitewashed Catholic church, and a fair-haired man in a priest's collar who stared at them from the doorway as they went past. He was sucking on a cigarette as if he did not enjoy smoking it. Maybe fug is a word then. Yeah, I was visualizing Bluejay too, because how many people can say they know a person named Bluejay? Good day to you, father, called Johnny Chapman, but the man in the dog collar made no reply. He crushed his cigarette under his heel, picked up the butt, and dropped it into the bin beside the door, and went inside. I told you not to give them those pamphlets last time you were here, said Harry Blue Jay. It is he that is in error, not me, said Chapman. If he'd just read the Swedenborg I gave him, he'd know that. It'd bring light into his life. Harry Blue Jay's car was missing its side mirrors, and its tires were the baldest Shadow had ever seen, perfectly smooth black rubber. Harry Blue Jay told them the car drank oil, but as long as you kept pouring oil in it, it would just keep running forever, unless it stopped. Harry Blue Jay filled a black garbage bag with shit from the car, said shit including several screw-top bottles of cheap beer, unfinished, a small packet of cannabis resin wrapped in silver foil and badly hidden in the car's ashtray, a skunk tail, 24 country and western cassettes, and a battered yellowing copy of Stranger in a Strange Land. Sorry I was jerking your chain before, said Harry Blue Jay to Wednesday, passing him the car keys. You know when I'll get the Winnebago? Ask your uncle, he's the fucking used car dealer, growled Wednesday. Wissaca Jack is not my uncle, said Harry Blue Jay. He took his black garbage bag and went into the nearest house and closed the door behind him. They dropped Johnny Chapman in Sioux Falls, outside a Whole Foods store. Wednesday said nothing on the drive. He was brooding. In a family restaurant just outside St. Paul, Shadow picked up a newspaper someone else had put down. He looked at it once, then again, then he showed it to Wednesday. Wednesday was in a black sulk, as he had been since the day they left Whiskey Jack's place. Look at that, said Shadow. Wednesday sighed and looked down at the paper with an expression of pain, as if lowering his head hurt more than he could put into words. I am, he said, delighted that the air traffic controller's dispute has been resolved without recourse to industrial action. Not that, said Shadow. Look, it says the 14th of February. Happy Valentine's Day. So we set out January the, 20th? 21st? I wasn't keeping track of the dates, but it was the 3rd week of January. We were 3 days on the road, all told. So how is it the 14th of February? Because we walked for almost a month, said Wednesday, in the Badlands, backstage. Hell of a shortcut, said Shadow. Wednesday pushed the paper away. Fucking Johnny Appleseed, always going on about Paul Bunyan. In real life, Chapman owned 14 apple orchards. He farmed thousands of acres. Yes, he kept pace with the western frontier, but there's not a story out there about him with a word of truth in it, save that he went a little crazy once. But it doesn't matter. Like the newspapers used to say, if the truth isn't big enough, you print the legend. This country needs its legends. And even the legends don't believe it anymore. But you see it. I'm a has-been. But you see it. I'm a has-been. Who the fuck cares about me? Shadow said softly, You're a god. Wednesday looked at him sharply. He seemed to be about to say something, and then he slumped back in his seat and looked down at the menu and said, So? It's a good thing to be a god, said Shadow. Is it? Asked Wednesday, and this time it was Shadow who looked away. In a gas station 25 miles outside Lakeside, on the wall by the restrooms, Shadow saw a homemade photocopied notice, a black and white photo of Allison McGovern and the handwritten question, Have you seen me, above it. Same yearbook photograph, smiling confidently, a girl with rubber band braces on her top teeth who wants to work with animals when she grows up. Have you seen me? Shadow bought a Snickers bar, a bottle of water, and a copy of the Lakeside News. The above-the-fold story, written by Marguerite Olson, our Lakeside reporter, showed a photograph of a boy and an older man out on the frozen lake, standing by an outhouse-like ice fishing shack, and between them they were holding a big fish. They were smiling. Father and son catch record northern pike. Full story inside. Wednesday was driving. He said, Read me anything interesting you find in the paper. Shadow looked carefully, and he turned the pages slowly, but he couldn't find anything. Wednesday dropped him off in the driveway outside his apartment. A smoke-colored cat stared at him from the driveway, then fled when he bent to stroke it. There's lots of cats in this book. Shadow stopped on the wooden deck outside his apartment and looked out at the lake, dotting here and there with green and brown ice fishing huts. Did I say dotting? Dotted here and there. Many of them had cars parked beside them. On the ice nearer the bridge sat the old green clunker, just as it had sat in the newspaper. March the 23rd, said Shadow, encouragingly. Round 9:15 in the morning. You can do it. Not a chance, said a woman's voice. April 3rd, 6 p.m. That way the day warms up the ice. Shadow smiled. Marguerite Olsen was wearing a ski suit. She was at the far end of the deck, refilling the bird feeder with white blocks of suet. I read your article in the Lakeside News on the town record Northern Pike. Exciting, huh? Well, educational, maybe. I thought you weren't coming back to us, she said. You were gone for a while, huh? My uncle needed me, said Shadow. The time kind of got away from us. She placed the last suet brick in its cage and began to fill the net sock with thistle seeds from a plastic milk jug. Several goldfinches, olive in their winter coats, twittered impatiently from a nearby fir tree. I didn't see anything in the paper about Allison McGovern. There wasn't anything to report. She's still missing. There was a rumor that someone had seen her in Detroit, but it turned out to be a false alarm. Poor kid. Marguerite Olsen screwed the top back onto the gallon jug. I hope she's dead, she said matter-of-factly. Shadow was shocked. Why? Because the alternatives are worse. The goldfinches hopped frantically from branch to branch of the fir tree, impatient for the people to be gone. A downy woodpecker joined them. You aren't thinking about Allison, thought Shadow. You're thinking of your son. You're thinking of Sandy. He remembered someone saying, I miss Sandy. Who was that? Good talking to you, he said. Yeah, she said. You too. February passed in a succession of short, gray days. Some days the snow fell, most days it didn't. The weather warmed up, and on the good days it got above freezing. Shadow stayed in his apartment until it began to feel like a prison cell, and then, on the days that Wednesday did not need him, he began to walk. He would walk for much of the day, long trudges out of town. He walked alone until he reached the national forests to the north and the west, or the cornfields and cow pastures to the south. He walked the Lumber County Wilderness Trail, and he walked along the old railroad tracks, and he walked the back roads. A couple of times he even walked along the frozen lake, from north to south. Sometimes he'd see locals or winter tourists or joggers, and he'd wave and say hi. Mostly he saw nobody at all, just crows and finches, and a few times he spotted a hawk feasting on a roadkill possum or raccoon. On one memorable occasion, he watched an eagle snatch a silverfish from the middle of the White Pine River, the water frozen at the edges, but still rushing and flowing at the center. The fish wriggled and jerked in the eagle's talons, glittering in the midday sun. Shadow imagined the fish freeing itself and swimming off across the sky, and he smiled. If he walked, he discovered, he did not have to think, and that was just the way he liked it. When he thought, his mind went to places he could not control, places that made him feel uncomfortable. Exhaustion was the best thing. When he was exhausted, his thoughts did not wander to Laura or to the strange dreams or to things that were not and could not be. He would return home from walking and sleep without difficulty and without dreaming. He ran into Police Chief Chad Mulligan in George's barber shop in the town square. Shadow always had high hopes for haircuts, but they never lived up to his expectations. After every haircut, he looked more or less the same, only with shorter hair. Chad, seated in the barber's chair beside Shadow's, seemed surprisingly concerned about his own appearance. When his haircut was finished, he gazed grimly at his reflection, as if he were preparing to give it a speeding ticket. It looks good, Shadow told him. Would it look good to you if you were a woman? I guess. They went across the square to Mabel's together, ordered mugs of hot chocolate. Chad said, Hey, Mike, have you ever thought about a career in law enforcement? Shadow shrugged. Can't say I have, he said. Seems like there's a whole lot of things you gotta know. Chad shook his head. You know the main part of police work, somewhere like this? It just keep in your head. Something happens, somebody's screaming at you, screaming blue murder, you just simply have to be able to say that you're sure that it's all a mistake, and that you'll just sort it all out if they just step outside quietly. And you have to be able to mean it. And then you sort it out? Mostly, that's when you put handcuffs on them. But yeah, you do what you can to sort it out. Let me know if you want a job. We're hiring, and you're the kind of guy we want. I'll keep that in mind, if the thing with my uncle falls through. They sipped their hot chocolate. Mulligan said, Say, Mike, what would you do if you had a cousin, like a widow, and she started calling you? Calling you how? On the phone, long distance. She lives out of state. His cheeks crimsoned. I saw her last year at a family wedding out in Oregon. She was married back then, though her husband was still alive, and she's family, not a first cousin, pretty distant. You got a thing for her? Blush. I don't know about that. Well then, put it another way. Does she have a thing for you? Well, she said a few things when she called. She's a very fine-looking woman. So, what are you going to do about it? I could ask her out here. I could do that. Couldn't I? She's kind of said she'd like to come up here. You're both adults. I'd say go for it. Shad nodded and blushed and nodded again. The telephone in Shadow's apartment was silent and dead. He thought about getting it connected, but he could think of no one he wanted to call. Late one night he picked it up and listened, and was convinced that he could hear a wind blowing in a distant conversation between a group of people whose voices were too faint to distinguish. He said, "Hello?" and "Who's there?" But there was no reply, only a sudden silence, and then the faraway sound of laughter, so faint that he was not certain he was not imagining it. Get some water. Yes, that would be a good time for that, but the cats are all tuckered out now. They wore themselves out and they're sleeping. Or sleepy, at least, yeah. Louie's right down here with his head on my leg. And he's a sleepy boy. Shadow made more journeys with Wednesday in the weeks that followed. He waited in the kitchen of a Rhode Island cottage and listened while Wednesday sat in a darkened bedroom and argued with a woman who would not get out of bed, nor would she let Wednesday or Shadow look at her face. In the refrigerator was a plastic bag filled with crickets and other filled with the corpses of baby mice. In a rock club in Seattle, Shadow watched Wednesday shout his greeting over the noise of the band to a young woman with short red hair and blue spiral tattoos. That talk must have gone well, for Wednesday came away from it grinning delightedly. 5 days later, Shadow was waiting in the rental when Wednesday walked, scowling, from the lobby of an office building in Dallas. Wednesday slammed the car door when he got in and sat there in silence, his face red with rage. He said, "Drive!" Then he said, "Fucking Albanians! Like anybody cares!" 3 days after that, they flew to Boulder, where they had a pleasant lunch with 5 young Japanese women. It was a meal of pleasantries and politeness, and Shadow walked away from it unsure of whether anything had been agreed to or decided. Wednesday, though, seemed happy enough. Shadow had begun to look forward to returning to Lakeside. There was a peace there, and a welcome that he appreciated. Each morning, when he was not away working for Wednesday, he would drive across the bridge to the town square. He would buy 2 pasties at Mabel's. He would eat 1 pasty and then and there, and drink a coffee. If someone had left a newspaper out, he would read it, although he was never interested enough in the news to purchase a newspaper himself. He would pocket the second pasty, wrapped in its paper bag, and eat it for his lunch. He was reading USA Today one morning when Mabel said, "Hey, Mike, where are you going today?" The sky was pale blue. The morning mist had left the trees covered with hoarfrost. "I don't know," said Shadow. "Maybe I'll walk the Wilderness Trail again." She refilled his coffee. "You ever gone east on County Q? It's kind of pretty out that way. That's the little road that starts across from the carpet store on 20th Avenue. "No, never have." "Well," she said, "it's kind of pretty." It was extremely pretty. Shadow parked his car at the edge of town and walked along the side of the road, a winding country road that curled around the hills to the east of the town. Each of the hills was covered with leafless maple trees, and bone-white birches, and dark firs and pines. There was no footpath, and Shadow walked along the middle of the road, making for the side whenever he heard a car. At one point, a small dark cat kept pace with him beside the road. It was the color of dirt, with white forepaws. He walked over to it. It did not run away. "Hey, cat," said Shadow, unselfconsciously. The cat put its head on one side, looked up at him with emerald eyes. Then it hissed. Not at him, but at something on the side of the road, something he could not see. "Easy," said Shadow. The cat stalked away across the road and vanished into a field of old unharvested corn. Around the next bend in the road, Shadow came upon a tiny graveyard. The headstones were weathered, although several of them had sprays of fresh flowers resting against them. There was no wall about the graveyard, and no fence, only low mulberry trees, planted at the margins, bent over with ice and age. Shadow stepped over the piled-up ice and slush at the end of the side of the road. There were 2 stone gateposts marking the entry to the graveyard, although there was no gate between them. He walked into the graveyard between the 2 posts. He wandered around the graveyard, looking at the headstones. There were no inscriptions later than 1969. He brushed the snow from a solid-looking granite angel, and he leaned against it. He took the paper bag from his pocket and removed the pasty from it. He broke off the top. It breathed a faint wisp of steam into the wintry air. It smelled really good, too. He bit into it. Something rustled behind him. He thought for a moment it was the cat, but then he smelled perfume, and under the perfume, the scent of something rotten. "Please don't look at me," she said from behind him. "Hello, Laura," said Shadow. Her voice was hesitant, perhaps, he thought, even a little scared. She said, "Hello, puppy." He broke off some pasty. "Would you like some?" he asked. She was standing immediately behind him now. "No," she said. "You eat it. I don't eat food anymore." He ate his pasty. It was good. "I want to look at you," he said. "You won't like it," she told him. "Please?" She stepped around the stone angel. Shadow looked at her in the daylight. Some things were different and some things were the same. Her eyes had not changed, nor had the crooked hopefulness of her smile. And she was very obviously very dead. Shadow finished his pasty. He stood up and tipped the crumbs out of the paper bag, then folded it up and put it back into his pocket. The time he had spent in the funeral home in Cairo made it easier somehow for him to be in her presence. He did not know what to say to her. Her cold hand sought his, and he squeezed it gently. He could feel his heart beating in his chest. He was scared, and what scared him was the normality of the moment. He felt so comfortable with her at his side that he would have been willing to stand there forever. "I miss you," he admitted. "I'm here," she said. "That's when I miss you most, when you're here. When you aren't here, when you're just a ghost from the past or a dream from another life, it's easier then." She squeezed his fingers. "So," he asked, "how's death?" "Hard," she said. "It just keeps going." She rested her head on his shoulder, and it almost undid him. He said, "You want to walk for a bit?" "Sure." She smiled up at him, a nervous, crooked smile in a dead face. They walked out of the little graveyard and made their way back down the road toward the town, hand in hand. "Where have you been?" she asked. "Here," he said, "mostly." "Since Christmas," she said. "I kind of lost you. Sometimes I would know where you were, for a few hours, for a few days. You'd be all over. Then you'd fade away again." "I was in this town," he said. "Lakeside. It's a good little town." "Oh," she said. She no longer wore the blue dress in which she had been buried. Now she wore several sweaters, a long dark skirt, and burgundy boots. Shadow commented on them. Laura ducked her head. She smiled. "Aren't they great boots? I found them in this great shoe store in Chicago." "So, what made you decide to come up from Chicago?" "Oh, I've not been in Chicago for a while, puppy. I was heading south. The cold was bothering me. You'd think I'd welcome it, but it's something to do with being dead, I guess. You don't feel it as cold. You feel it as sort of nothing. And when you're dead, I guess the only thing you're scared of is nothing. I was going to go to Texas. I planned to spend the winter in Galveston. I think I used to winter in Galveston when I was a kid." "I don't think you did," said Shadow. "You've never mentioned it before." "No? Maybe it was someone else then. I don't know. I remember seagulls, throwing bread in the air for seagulls, hundreds of them. The whole sky becoming nothing but seagulls as they flapped their wings and snatched the bread from the air." She paused. "If I didn't see it, I guess someone else did." A car came around the corner. The driver waved them hello. Shadow waved back. It felt wonderfully normal to walk with his wife. "This feels good," said Laura, as if she was reading his mind. "Yes," said Shadow. "I'm pleased it feels good for you, too. When the call came, I had to hurry back. I was barely into Texas." "Call?" She looked up at him. Around her neck, the gold coin glinted. "It felt like a call," she said. "I started to think about you, about how much more fun I would have with you than down in Galveston, about how much I needed to see you. It was like a hunger." "You knew I was here, then?" "Yes." She stopped. She frowned, and her upper teeth pressed into her blue lower lip, biting it gently. She put her head on one side and said, "I did. Suddenly, I did. I thought you were calling me, but it wasn't you, was it?" "No." "You didn't want to see me." "It wasn't that." He hesitated. No, I didn't want to see you. It hurts too much." The snow crunched beneath their feet, and it glittered diamonds as the sunlight caught it. "It must be hard," said Laura, "not being alive." "You mean it's hard for you to be dead? Look, I'm still going to figure out how to bring you back, properly. I think I'm on the right track." "No," she said. "I mean, I'm grateful, and I hope you really can do it. I did a lot of bad stuff." She shook her head. "But I was talking about you." "I'm alive," said Shadow. "I am not dead, remember?" "You're not dead," she said, "but I'm not sure that you're alive, either. Not really." This isn't the way this conversation goes, thought Shadow. This isn't the way anything goes. "I love you," she said dispassionately. "You're my puppy. But when you're really dead, you get to see things clearer. It's like there isn't anyone there. You know? You're like this big, solid, man-shaped hole in the world. She frowned. Even when we were together, I loved being with you because you adored me and you would do anything for me, but sometimes I'd go into a room and I wouldn't think there was anybody in there. And I'd turn the light on, or I'd turn the light off, and I'd realize that you were in there, sitting on your own, not reading, not watching TV, not doing anything. She hugged him then, as if to take the sting from her words, and she said, "The best thing about Robbie was that he was somebody. He was a jerk sometimes, and he could be a joke, and he loved to have mirrors around when we made love so he could watch himself fucking me, but he was alive, puppy. He wanted things. He filled the space." She stopped, looked up at him, tipped her head a little to one side. "I'm sorry. Did I hurt your feelings?" He did not trust his voice not to betray him, so he simply shook his head. "Good," she said. "That's good." They were approaching the rest area where he had parked his car. Shadow felt that he needed to say something. "I love you," or "Please don't go," or "I'm sorry." The kind of words you used to patch a conversation that had lurched, without warning, into the dark places. Instead, he said, "I'm not dead." "Maybe not," she said. "But are you sure you're alive?" "Look at me," he said. "That's not an answer," said his dead wife. "You'll know it when you are." "What now?" he said. "Well," she said, "I've seen you now. I'm going south again." "Back to Texas?" "Somewhere warm. I don't care." "I have to wait here," said Shadow, "until my boss needs me." "That's not living," said Laura. She sighed, and then she smiled. The same smile that had been able to tug at his heart no matter how many times he saw it. Every time she smiled at him, had been the first time all over again. "Will I see you again?" She looked up at him and she stopped smiling. "I guess so," she said. "In the end. Nothing's finished yet, is it?" "No," he said. "It's not." He went to put his arm around her, but she shook her head and pulled out of his reach. She sat down on the edge of a snow-covered picnic table, and she watched him drive away. All right. Well, that's the end of that chapter.